Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring the absolute foundational era of our language and stories, the Old English or Anglo-Saxon period. If you've ever wondered where the incredible tapestry of English literature truly begins, well, you're in the right place. Okay, let's dive into this.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the origins of Old English, warrior culture and bards, decoding Old English poetry, Beowulf, the first epic, elegies and religious verse, and finally, the rise of English prose. Let's get right into it.
So, where does English literature actually begin? You'd naturally think it starts in, well, England, right? But surprisingly, it doesn't start there at all. It actually begins across the water, with continental Germanic tribes. Section 1. Origins of Old English, spanning from 410 AD to 1066 AD. To really grasp this literature, we first have to look at the historical crucible that birthed the language itself. Picture this. It's the year 410 AD, and the mighty Roman forces have just packed up and abandoned Britain. This sudden departure leaves the native Britons completely exposed and highly vulnerable to fierce northern invaders, specifically the Picts and the Scots. So, after the Romans leave, a British leader named King Vortigern makes a pretty fateful decision in 450 AD. To defend his lands, he hires 3 Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Now, they successfully repelled the northern invaders, sure, but then they quickly took over Britain for themselves, driving the native Britons out into what is now Wales and Scotland. This newly conquered region became known as Angleland, which, you guessed it, eventually evolved into England. And their language, that became Englische, or English. Later on, Viking raids in the 8th and 9th centuries further shaped this culture, right up until the Norman conquest of 1066 officially brought the whole period to a close.
Section 2, warrior culture and bards, specifically life before print. Before we can really decode the poetry and stories these people left behind, we have to understand exactly how they lived, how they fought, and how they entertained themselves in a world long before printed books were even a thing.
The culture of this time was firmly built on 3 main pillars. First, you have the Comitatus code. Second, the scop, or oral poet. And third, the arrival of Christianity in 597 AD. This third pillar is absolutely massive, because when St. Augustine introduced Christianity to Britain, he didn't just bring religion. He brought monasteries and the Latin alphabet. That technology finally allowed monks to take generations of oral storytelling and, for the very first time, write it all down. Let's look a little closer at that first pillar. The Comitatus Code was a rigid, warrior-focused societal pact. Basically, a king or chieftain provided food, gold, and weapons to his men. In return, his warriors pledged absolute, unwavering loyalty to him. This was harsh reality, guys. To leave your chief on the battlefield or to survive if he fell in combat was considered the ultimate societal disgrace. It was literally viewed as worse than death. This intense code of loyalty and honor bleeds into almost every single piece of literature from this era. Next up, we have the scop. Think of the scop as the ultimate entertainer of the era. Remember, paper just didn't exist for these early tribes. So instead, these bards would stand up in noisy, fire-lit mead halls, strumming a lyre or a harp and reciting massive, heroic stories entirely from memory. They were the historians, the musicians, and the movie theaters of their day, all rolled into one person. Section 3. Decoding Old English poetry. Let's look at the Old English style. How did these scops actually construct their stories? Well, if you look closely at their verse, you'll notice they didn't rely on the modern rhyming patterns we're so used to today. Instead, they used a few really unique stylistic tools that made their poetry distinct and, crucially, memorable. Consider this incredibly chilling line. Grendel came greedy and grim. This perfectly highlights their first major tool, alliteration. Alliteration is just the repetition of consonant sounds within a single line. Because the scop had to memorize thousands of lines and recite them over the roaring noise of a crowded mead hall, repeating those hard G sounds made the oral storytelling punchy, rhythmic, incredibly catchy, and way easier to commit to memory. They also relied heavily on what's called a caesura. A caesura is a natural pause or break right in the middle of every poetic line. And this wasn't just some fancy stylistic choice, it was a highly practical tool. It literally gave the passionate, shouting reciter a brief moment to catch their breath before launching into the second half of the phrase. And this brilliantly illustrates kennings. They used these vivid compound metaphors all the time. So instead of just saying the sea, a poet would call it the whale road. The human body wasn't just a body, it was a bone house. And the king, who distributed treasure under that Comitatus code we just talked about, was known as the ring giver. It is just an incredibly evocative way to build a world using language. Section 4, Beowulf, the first epic, rightly known as the crown jewel. This is where we shift to the major heroic poetry of the era, and we absolutely have to talk about the undisputed masterpiece of early English literature. Composed anonymously sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries, this epic poem is a foundational pillar of Western storytelling. That number right there, 3,182, represents the massive scale of Beowulf. At over 3,000 lines, it is the first major epic in English literature. And what makes it a true masterwork is how it seamlessly blends the harsh, pagan warrior values of the Germanic tribes with the early Christian theology that was being introduced by the monks who finally wrote it down. The narrative of Beowulf is a total action-packed blockbuster. In the first half, our hero travels to Denmark and literally defeats the terrifying monster Grendel barehanded. He rips the monster's arm off just to save King Hrothgar's hall. Then, when Grendel's vengeful mother attacks in retaliation, Beowulf tracks her down and fights her in a supernatural underwater cave. Fast forward 50 years, and an elderly King Beowulf still steps up to slay a massive, fire-breathing dragon that's guarding a hoard of treasure. He defeats the beast, but tragically dies from his injuries, securing his ultimate heroic legacy. Section 5, Elegies and Religious Verse, focusing on sorrow and lost glory. We're going to transition now from that high-octane epic to something much more introspective. Because alongside all those heroic battles, most Old English poetry actually carried a deeply melancholic, elegiac tone. It was filled with a profound sense of nostalgia and sorrow for lost glory. In the famous elegy Dior's Lament, we find the phrase, "That passed away, so may this." Let that comforting refrain sink in for a second. It's a beautiful, stoic reminder of the passage of time and surviving hardship. This sits right alongside other famous short elegies like The Wanderer and The Seafarer, which deeply explored themes of isolation, loneliness, and the harsh, unforgiving nature of the freezing, cold sea that constantly surrounded them. When we look at the religious poetry of the time, a few fascinating figures and quirks really stand out. First is Caedmon, who is considered the very first recorded English poet. He famously composed Caedmon's hymn after an angel visited him in a dream. Then there's Cynewulf, who cleverly signed his manuscripts using secret runic letters woven right into the text. No way, right? And then we have a masterpiece called The Dream of the Rood. In this poem, the Holy Cross itself actually speaks in a dream. But what's incredible here is that it describes Christ as a fierce, heroic warrior. It's a perfect blend of the new Christian theology with that deeply ingrained pagan warrior culture. Section 6, The Rise of English Prose, Documenting History. For our final stop, we're looking at a literary development that happened a bit later, in the 9th and 10th centuries. While poetry was the spoken language of the Scops and the mead halls, prose became the crucial written tool for documenting their history and everyday life. So the crucial point is that understanding this shift really comes down to two monumental figures. On one side, we have the Venerable Bede, the father of English history. He wrote an expansive history of the English people, but he wrote it entirely in Latin. Contrast that with King Alfred the Great, the father of English prose. Alfred took a huge step by personally translating Latin texts directly into Old English. He even commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was a massive year-by-year history of England, but written in the language of the common people. And here is a truly miraculous fact. When you think about the fires, the Viking raids, and the sheer passage of over 1,000 years of time, it's absolutely astonishing that we have any of this literature left at all. Nearly all of the surviving Old English poetry we just covered, Beowulf, the elegies, the religious verses, is preserved today in just these 4 incredibly fragile documents: the Nowell Codex, the Exeter Book, the Vercelli Book, and the Junius manuscript. Without these 4 books, an entire era of human history and imagination would literally be completely lost to the dark. Every single English word you speak today traces its roots back to the chaotic, brilliant era of the Anglo-Saxons. From blood-soaked mead halls to quiet monasteries, this period forged the absolute foundation of our language. So the next time you write a sentence, ask yourself, how much of the ancient warrior and how much of the quiet monk is hiding in your own words? Which literary work or historical period should we break down next in the explainer? Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.